Our third presentation is from Max.
In a book by one of the leading Marxists of pre-colonial Tunisia, Khalifa Shatter, titled in English Dependence and Pre-Colonial Mutations, Shatter describes the attempt by Ahmed Bey to break free of Tunisia's dependence on agricultural commodity exports, with their externally determined prices and frequently deteriorating terms of trade. He describes an example of a factory for drapes in Taborba. Artisans handled the manual tasks well, but weaving looms and motors needed more complex techniques, for which the population was poorly prepared. Furthermore, much of the technology was imported, harming the country's balance of payments. A greater failure was one of scale. The markets were too small, and he failed to enlarge them. Crucially, he did not seek to modernize or build on existing technologies, the techniques which already existed in Tunisia. Instead, as Shatter notes, he opted for ex nihilo creations. He even introduced totally new industries, veritable enclaves at the heart of the traditional society. This early effort in Tunisia of seizing control of its own productive destiny failed amidst the failure of the enterprises. The funds for these failed projects came from an overtaxed agricultural base, which eventually cascaded into ruin, bankrupting the country and leading to its loss of economic sovereignty to the European powers. To use modern terms, the experience was an early and failed attempt in import substitution industrialization, and only later, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, did intellectuals and economists develop a theoretical account of what had been happening in Tunisia and how to arrest it. For the remainder of this presentation, I want to lay out, first, a vision of delinking, or auto-centered self-reliant development, and discuss it as one of the central dissenting visions for economic development in the global South, and especially Africa. Second, I will describe what theorists meant by this form of development, especially as it related to the agricultural sector. And then I will discuss the proposed techniques, methodologies, and research programs of a Tunisian economist named Salaheddine el Amami, who was the outstanding critic and researcher in Tunisia of alternative agricultural technologies before his death of cancer in 1985 at the age of 55. I will discuss their relationship to the delinking paradigm and how they were an explicit or implicit criticism of the central ideology of Tunisian developmentalism, which was a top-down form of imported technological modernity. Delinking was a concept born out of a system of thought which saw the North-South divide as elemental to global capitalism. It was structural, but was also constitutive. In this notion, the North developed because the South was denied development, stuck in dependent development. Each region and each country experienced a different form of incorporation, but the common thread was one of developmentally ambivalent middle layers in the non-core countries who steered various forms of state capitalism. That middle layer, in turn, often linked the country's destiny to exterior powers, rather than building on the lower strata of the society. Delinking accounted for the strength of this class through its insertion into global power relationships. So only through delinking and a conditional and selective embrace of exterior capital and technological flows could global South states develop. In the words of Samir Amin, it did not mean autarky. It meant the organization of a system of criteria for the rationality of economic choices based on a law of value which has a national foundation and a popular content. A national foundation did not mean cutting off developing societies from the world. It meant, quoting again, submitting the external relations to the logic of an internal development that is independent from them. Mohamed Dowidar explains what this meant. It was a model of development meant to repattern internal production. First of all, eliminating the control of foreign capital, which consistently steered technological choices in its own interests. Second, eliminating luxury consumption, liberating the economic surplus from waste. With resources freed up, it would be possible to shift what Dowidar calls the production forces of society, conceived of as basically the labor force acting in a certain technological milieu. He was keen to sidestep seeing productive forces as merely a technological question, instead seeing them as the liberation of the creative power of the working people through increases in their standard of living, and then improving, quoting, the technical formation of the labor force and the increase in the quantity and quality of the means of production. In the agricultural sector, he saw that the objective would be to transform it into a branch of industry where science and technology could be applied. But he saw technology and science in specific ways, not as revolution from above, imported impositions. One departure was where he called for industry to mimic agriculture, emphasizing a search for substitutes for exhaustible, non-reproducible resources. Regarding technology, he insisted that this not be a process of replacement or of technology transfers. He saw technology as having a cyborg-like relationship with the labor force, noting the problem was that of the national labor force recovering a technological milieu, one within which it can not only assimilate but create new techniques. This was not a rejection of the old, but rather a call for institutional and pedagogical development of the human level of society. It was a call, quoting again, for the development of local techniques on the basis of effecting the appropriate selection of these techniques. Such a policy should aim at the development of local techniques on the basis of a historical study of the process of their social selection, which will be related by definition to the environment, in order to see whether they can be used as they are, with modification, or have to be further developed. This programmatic statement relied on the development of local expertise. In particular, given the centrality of place or of ecology, it highlights the need for independent agronomic and ecological expertise. It also shows how the possibility and time frame of delinking is necessarily a socio-technical question linked to indigenous, technical, and natural capacities. It is to what capacities might have existed, but more importantly for the context of this workshop, the method of seeking out and building on such capacities that I now turn, examining this question through the life's work of Salaheddine el Amami. Amami focused on irrigation, both means of water delivery and gathering rainwater. But more broadly, he was concerned with the contradiction between the overall agricultural capacities or natural endowments of Tunisia and the lackluster way farmers were using the land. He saw property structures and state policy as dual and twinned elements of this problem. One issue he put forth was the quantity of agricultural engineers under French colonialism as compared to post-colonial Tunisia. Under colonialism, for the French lands, there was one engineer for every 500 hectares. Tunisia, in the 70s and 80s, had one engineer for every 2,000 hectares. The state farms, or the cooperative production units, had a level of engineers 10 times below than at the experimental and successful Fretisa farm, where the government had managed to achieve cereal yields at European levels. He noted that the private sector refused to manage the best lands properly or to make any use at all of local technical knowledge. At the state level, the National Agricultural Institute was producing civil engineers who managed dam construction, not agronomic engineers who did field expeditions. Meanwhile, the modern sector continued to rely on extensive production for profit rather than for production. The owners, most of whom were absentee, sought to invest minimal capital, and so they shied away from employing engineers. And this sector was 25% of Tunisia's arable land. His proposal was to put in place a contract in which the state paid engineers their salaries and they would receive a bonus based on profits from increased yields, with long-term 9 to 27-year contracts. As he saw it, this could achieve Tunisian food security, mobilize thousands of farmers, and for an investment from the state of 10 million Tunisian dinars per year, yield 50 million Tunisian dinars in savings on cereal imports. On smaller plots, he suggested enlisting 60,000 rural youth who had failed out of school and giving them technical training and techniques to move to a more intensive production method, improving overall production and damming the rural exodus. Here I want to pull out a couple of threads from this proposal. First is the question of abstraction versus field knowledge. As Amami knew, farms cannot be managed as a technical problem by engineers based in a metropolis, treating them as purely mechanical processes of production. Agriculture is an organic process, an interface between humans and the ecology. To maximize what that ecology can provide, humans require specialized knowledge to understand the ecology. Amami also understood that this would take time, hence the proposal for 9 to 27-year contracts. Learning a farm is a process and not an instant. Finally, there is a notion of delinking, of perceiving the exchange relationship of cereal purchase as an actual leakage of the country's wealth and taking steps to repattern internal production so as to keep value local, which also meant a rural-urban rebalancing. Another of his preoccupations was the deployment of scarce resources and damming the outflow of value from the national circulatory system, which he explored through his analysis of energy use in Tunisian agriculture. After summarizing the use of energy in farming within Tunisia, he pointed out that if the modernization model meant to mimic the Western one, a ton of petroleum per hectare, it would exhaust the country's petroleum resources before even reaching half of the consumption of the Western farming model. In the place of this, he said, I'm quoting, "This brings us to a conception totally in rupture with the conventional one, to elaborate technologies rehabilitating local practices and improving them, and which, because of their very decentralized character, could better partake of extremely diffuse sources of energy of the arid and semi-arid regions, biomass, sun, wind." This call for a focus on local technology is of a programmatic rather than specific character, in part because it is a call for a specific type of agronomic or agroecological research using local field visits, combining engineering, accumulated local knowledge, and trained agronomists. Such a combination of expertise could see what local knowledge was already out there and whether it could be improved. It was also a call which was reflective of the environment of the majority of Tunisia, arid and semi-arid. He also made a separation here between the concentrated but expensive energy in hydrocarbons and the decentralized energy of biomass, sun, and wind. Ahead of its time, it is a call for a decentralized, essentially solar-powered form of energy democracy in the agricultural sector, keeping in mind that biomass, wind, and the sun are all forms of solar energy, and thus on human timescales, infinitely renewable. Finally, another example of this research orientation was how Amami approached the question of local irrigation technologies. This was a consistent preoccupation of his, using rainwater for agricultural intensification. He first discussed the state of knowledge in the 70s, noting that existing research in 1977 was very scarce as concerned hydrological mechanisms at the level of micro-watersheds and non-existent at the level of individual mescats or jasors, the small-scale indigenous hydraulics most suited to a capital-scarce, arid country. As he knew, without knowing precisely the hydrology of micro-watersheds, it is impossible to assess whether and where to build indigenous hydraulics. This is a question of knowledge, and what kind of knowledge is sought, which cannot be innocent of the power relations which govern the production of knowledge. In discussing several experiments in using runoff water in Shat Miriam, a research center near Suisse, south of Tunis, he noted several factors which led to their failure. One was that the work was heavy to conduct. It required and requires a local infrastructure for experimentation and monitoring, whereas the country's research establishments were centralized, creating an obstacle in front of any who might wish to have carried out local experiments. The second reason was, in essence, the other side of the coin of the first reason. That was the decision to build grand hydraulics, which, I'm quoting, had engaged and polarized all energies towards work on major watersheds generally located in the north, thereby discrediting any intellectual efforts invested in small and insignificant hydraulic installations. Offices linked to the large public sector had themselves played a role in orienting research and interest towards large hydraulic installations, which of course were also pushed on Tunisia by the international institutions, especially the World Bank. Without this sort of research, it was difficult to know how to build appropriate input-output models which could examine the profitability and productivity of using these waters for irrigation. And so he raised up the critical need to find data on precipitation and hydrology in microbasins in order to establish when and where people could place indigenous hydraulics. In this same essay, he goes on to discuss how overexpansion of the olive plantations, which trace back to the colonial indigenous co-production of planting for profit of the late 1890s, had led to the overexpansion of olive planting onto the impluvium of the Muscat, which was its catchment area for rainwater. Herds of animals, which used to be complementary with olive irrigation, olive production, were pushed into more marginal zones. Using data drawn from colonial-era surveys, he established that until the end of the 19th century, the ratio of the catchment area, the impluvium, to land planted with olives was 3-to-1. By the 1970s, it had become 1-to-4. The measures he took from the experiment before it faltered suggested that the runoff coefficient was between 20 and 35%. Given the physiology of the olive tree, this was equivalent to 2,000 cubic meters of irrigation per hectare, which would allow greatly increased yields and also allow animals to graze on the catchment area, thereby reestablishing the complementarity of grazing and olive production. And the point here is less whether or not such analyses are correct per se, and more the methods and programs for research they imply. And so a few core elements. 1, building on local knowledge. 2, using that historically acquired polytechnic of how to use scarce resources more efficiently to, in the future, use scarce resources more efficiently. 3rd, to increase yields and thereby build endogenous value. 4, to allow for increased animal feeding. 5, to prevent erosion and flooding and thereby prevent entropy in the agricultural system. And 6, to allow animal waste to be used for fertilizer. This is an example of how to use local resources to lock in value and build up the necessary agricultural capacity for endogenous and self-centered development. It also closes urban-rural ecological leakages, the broken organic waste cycle. And so what this finally shows is the complementarity between engineers, hydrologists studying microbasins, farmers, and others more directly involved in the production cycle. It shows the necessity of how any developmental project but especially delinking, must draw on the full repertoire of indigenous capacities and build on them, and thus shows the complementarity between technical expertise, local knowledge, and long-term developmental planning. Thank you.